Have you ever made a split-second decision that ruined your life? Or maybe it saved it. I didn't know who he was. To me, he was just a guy bleeding out in a dark alley, cornered by men holding guns. I didn't think. I just walked up, grabbed his jacket, and kissed him. A desperate, stupid move to convince them we were just two drunk lovers. It worked. But here's the thing about kissing the devil. He tends to follow you home. The neon sign above Pell's Diner hadn't buzzed properly since October. It spat a sickly, intermittent red light onto the wet pavement, spelling out OPN to the stray dogs and insomniacs of the South Side. Charlotte pushed through the heavy metal back door, the hinges screaming a familiar protest. 2 a.m. Her shift was over, but the smell of burnt filter coffee and heavy fryer grease clung to her skin like a second layer of clothing. She dug into the pocket of her oversized cardigan, fingers bypassing a handful of sticky quarters to find a crushed pack of cigarettes. She didn't even smoke that much anymore. They were just an excuse to stand still for 5 minutes before the mile-long walk to her apartment. The alley was freezing. November had settled into the city's bones, bringing a damp chill that ignored fabric and went straight for the joints. Charlotte put the cigarette between her lips, struck a match, and cupped her hands around the flame. That was when she heard the heavy, wet thud. It sounded like a sack of wet flour hitting a brick wall, followed immediately by the sharp, undeniable scrape of leather on asphalt. Charlotte froze, the match burning down to her fingertips. She pinched it out, plunging herself back into the shadows near the dumpsters. 30 feet away, where the alley fed into a narrow service street, 3 silhouettes bled out of the darkness. 2 of them were standing. 1 was on his knees. Charlotte held her breath. The city had rules. Rule number 1, keep your head down. Rule number 2, if it doesn't involve your paycheck, you didn't see it. You're making this tedious, one of the standing men said. His voice was casual, bored even. The man on his knees didn't answer. A heavy, ragged cough tore out of his chest, accompanied by the distinct splatter of fluid hitting the pavement. Charlotte pressed her spine against the cold brick of the diner. She needed to step back, slip inside, and lock the deadbolt. But her feet felt rooted to the concrete. Through the gloom, the ambient streetlight caught a flash of dull metal. A gun. The bored man was raising a suppressed pistol, aiming it square at the back of the kneeling man's head. There was no time to rationalize. There was no time to weigh the moral implications against her own survival. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the suffocating monotony of her life breaking her brain. Charlotte stepped out from the dumpsters. She walked fast, her beat-up combat boots making sharp, deliberate sounds against the wet concrete. The 2 standing men snapped their attention toward her, the gun instantly leveling at her chest. "Hey!" Charlotte yelled, pitching her voice up, slurring it just a fraction. "Tommy, you son of a bitch, I told you to wait by the car!" She didn't stop moving. The men hesitated, thrown off by the sheer audacity of her approach. If she was a threat, she wouldn't be stomping toward them with a crushed cigarette in her mouth. She reached the kneeling man before the gunman could recalibrate. Charlotte grabbed the heavy wool of the kneeling man's coat. She hauled him upward with a strength born entirely of adrenaline. He was heavier than he looked, solid muscle and dead weight, but he stumbled to his feet, swaying. His head snapped toward her. In the ambient light, she saw blood coating the left side of his face. His eyes were dark, tracking her with a cold, terrifying clarity that completely contradicted his battered state. "Don't talk," she breathed into his collar. Before he could react, Charlotte threw her arms around his neck, stood on her tiptoes, and smashed her mouth against his. It wasn't a movie kiss. It was violent and jarring. Their teeth clicked together painfully. She tasted copper, rain, and the bitter ash of her own cigarette. He was rigid against her, a statue made of ice and tension. His hands hovered at his sides, not touching her, but his breathing hitched, catching in his throat. She pressed closer, angling her body to shield him from the gunman, burying one hand in his hair and using the other to fist his coat. She poured every ounce of frantic, desperate energy into the charade, grinding her lips against his, praying the shadows hid the lack of romance. "Who the hell are you?" a voice barked. The bored man. He was closer now. Charlotte broke the kiss, but kept her face inches from the stranger's. She let out a breathy, annoyed sigh and turned her head to glare over her shoulder. "I'm his girlfriend," Charlotte snapped, dialing up the volume. "And I'm sick of him getting trashed and picking fights in alleys. Back off. He's had enough." The man with the gun paused, glancing at his partner. They were looking for a target, not an audience. A dead body in an empty alley was business. A dead body with a screaming civilian witness was a liability. "Your boyfriend owes people money," the second man grunted, keeping his hand inside his jacket. "Take a number," Charlotte shot back, rolling her eyes. She grabbed the stranger's arm, pulling it over her shoulder. He complied, instantly leaning into her, playing the part of a dead drunk loser perfectly. "Come on, Tommy. If I have to carry you to the subway, I'm taking your television." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and began walking back toward the diner's heavy metal door, dragging him with her. Every step felt like walking through deep water. The crosshairs of the gun burned a phantom hole between her shoulder blades. "Don't shoot! Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" They reached the door. Charlotte fumbled blindly with her free hand, grabbed the handle and yanked it open. She shoved him inside, stumbled in after him, and slammed the heavy door shut, throwing the deadbolt and the chain with a series of loud metallic clacks. Only then did she let out a breath, her knees instantly turning to liquid. The back room of Pell's was a narrow corridor lined with bags of onions, a mop sink, and a single folding chair beneath a flickering fluorescent bulb. The air hummed with the sound of the massive walk-in freezer. Charlotte leaned against the door, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no pounding on the metal. She turned around. The man was leaning heavily against the industrial sink, pressing a hand to his ribs. Under the harsh, sterile light, he didn't look like a Tommy. He was in his early 30s, maybe. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a bespoke charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than her entire annual salary, though it was currently ruined by dirt and a dark, wet stain spreading across the left side. His face was all sharp angles and bruised shadows, his jaw tight, but it was his eyes that made Charlotte's heart stutter. They weren't the eyes of a victim. They were calm, utterly, terrifyingly calm. He was assessing the room, the exits, and finally, her. "Tommy," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. "It was the first name that came to mind," Charlotte muttered, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. The taste of his blood was still there. She walked past him, giving him a wide berth, and pulled a battered white first aid kit from the top of the ice machine. "You're bleeding," she stated, popping the plastic latches. "I'm aware. Take the coat off." He didn't move. He just stared at her, unblinking. "Who are you? The idiot who just saved your life. Take the coat off before you bleed out on my boss's linoleum. I don't get paid enough to mop up plasma." For a second, she thought he might refuse. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he unbuttoned the overcoat and let it slide off his shoulders. Underneath, he wore a tailored black shirt, clinging to his torso with sweat and blood. He unbuttoned the lower half, revealing an ugly, jagged gash along his lower ribs. A bullet graze. Close, but it hadn't penetrated the cavity. Charlotte sucked in a breath through her teeth, grabbed a bottle of saline and a stack of gauze, and stepped up to him. "This is going to burn," she said flatly. "Do it." She uncapped the bottle and poured it directly over the wound. He didn't flinch. He didn't hiss. The muscles in his abdomen jumped, rigid and defined, but his face remained a mask of stone. Charlotte pressed a thick wad of gauze against the bleeding skin, applying hard pressure. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating off his skin. He smelled like expensive cedarwood, rain, and gunpowder. "You shouldn't have stepped out," he said quietly, looking down at the top of her head. "You're welcome," she replied, keeping her eyes fixed on the wound. "I'm not thanking you. I'm telling you a fact. People who step into alleys like that don't usually walk out. Well, lucky for you, my survival instincts are currently out of order." Charlotte grabbed a roll of medical tape, tearing off strips with her teeth. "What did you do? Piss off a loan shark? Sleep with the wrong guy's wife?" A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Something like that. Right. Well, I'm taping this down. You need stitches, but you're not getting them here. You have a safe place to go?" "Yes." She taped the gauze tightly against his skin, pulling the black fabric of his shirt back into place. "Good. Because as soon as I'm done, you're leaving out the front door. You walk 2 blocks north, catch the night bus, and you never come back to this diner. Understood?" He looked at her. Really looked at her. His gaze dropped briefly to her lips, and Charlotte felt a sudden, irrational spike of heat in her chest. She remembered the sheer force of the kiss, the rough texture of his jaw against hers. She shoved the memory away instantly. "Understood," he said softly. Charlotte stepped back, tossing the bloody wrappers into the trash can. She walked over to the mop sink and turned on the hot water, vigorously scrubbing her hands with cheap pink soap. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a cold, trembling exhaustion in its wake. She had just put herself between an armed killer and his target. She was insane. She was actually insane. When she dried her hands and turned around, the room was empty. Charlotte blinked. The folding chair was bare. The back door was still deadbolted. She hurried down the short hallway into the main diner area. The lights were off, the chairs stacked on the tables. The front door, which she had locked an hour ago, was closed, but the deadbolt was turned horizontally. Unlocked. He was gone. No thank you. No goodbye. Just gone like a ghost. Charlotte locked the door, leaned her forehead against the cool glass, and stared out into the empty street. She told herself she was glad he was gone. She told herself she would forget the whole thing by morning. She was wrong. 4 days passed, 96 hours of lukewarm coffee, complaining truckers, and the relentless hum of the fryer later. Charlotte settled back into the grey rhythm of her life, deliberately pushing the memory of the bloody man in the alley into a locked box in her mind. It was a Thursday night, 11:30 p.m. The diner was dead. It was just Charlotte wiping down the counter, and Dave, the line cook, aggressively scraping the grill in the back. Rain lashed against the large front windows, distorting the street lights into blurry halos. The bell above the door chimed. Charlotte didn't look up, tossing her rag into the sanitizer bucket. "Take any booth you like. Coffee's fresh, but the grill is off in 30 minutes. No one answered. The only sound was the heavy, synchronized thud of leather shoes on the black and white checkered floor. Charlotte looked up, a polite, automated smile forming on her lips, and felt her stomach drop into her shoes. There were 2 of them. They weren't truck drivers, and they weren't college kids looking for sober-up fries. They wore dark suits under heavy, water-resistant trench coats. Their faces were entirely devoid of expression, their eyes scanning the diner with clinical efficiency, before locking onto her. Charlotte recognized one of them instantly, the bored voice from the alley. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she forced her face to remain perfectly blank. She picked up a menu, walked over to the counter directly across from where they had stopped, and set it down. "Just coffee?" she asked, her voice steady. The bored man leaned against the counter. Up close, his eyes were a pale, washed-out blue. "You work late, miss." "It pays the rent. Coffee?" He ignored the menu. He reached into his trench coat. Charlotte's muscles coiled, ready to dive behind the counter. But he only pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the formica surface. "We're looking for someone. A man. Might have been in this area a few nights ago." Charlotte didn't touch the paper. She just looked down at it. It was a grainy surveillance photo printed in black and white. It was him. The man from the alley. He was wearing a suit in the photo, looking sharp and untouchable, but it was undoubtedly him. "Doesn't look familiar," Charlotte said smoothly, "but a lot of people come through here." The second man, who was built like a cinder block, shifted his weight. He was bleeding. "Would have needed help. If someone came in here bleeding, I'd have called an ambulance," Charlotte said, meeting the bored man's gaze. "I wipe down tables. I don't do triage." The bored man stared at her. The silence stretched, tight and suffocating. The air in the diner felt incredibly thin. "You know," the man said softly. "4 nights ago, we ran into a bit of a snag in the alley out back. A drunk girl helping her boyfriend. We let it go. It was raining. We were tired. But we went back and checked the security cameras on the street corner. The girl walked into the alley alone." Charlotte stopped breathing. The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Where is he, sweetheart?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Charlotte said, her voice finally trembling. She took a step back. "I'm going to ask you to leave." The cinderblock man moved so fast it was a blur. He reached across the counter, his massive hand clamping around Charlotte's wrist like a vice. He jerked her forward, her hip slamming painfully against the edge of the counter. "Dave!" Charlotte screamed, panic finally shattering her composure. "Dave's taking a nap," the bored man said gently, nodding toward the kitchen window. Charlotte saw a pair of legs on the floor in the back. "Dave, you're going to tell us where Dominic Rossi is," the bored man said, pulling a suppressed pistol from his coat and resting it on the counter, pointed directly at her stomach. "Or you're going to join Dave." Dominic Rossi. The name echoed in her head. She knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. He wasn't a street thug. He wasn't a guy in debt. Dominic Rossi was the head of the largest syndicate on the eastern seaboard. He was a ghost, a myth, a monster who ran the docks and half the politicians in the state. She had kissed the head of the Mafia and called him Tommy before Charlotte could process the sheer, terrifying magnitude of her mistake. The bell above the front door chimed again. The sound was jarringly cheerful. The bored man cursed, turning slightly, keeping the gun hidden by his body. "Diner's closed, pal. Get out." "The sign says open," a voice replied. Charlotte gasped. The hand holding her wrist loosened just a fraction in surprise. Standing in the doorway, rain dripping from a black umbrella, was Dominic Rossi. He wasn't wearing a bloody, ruined coat. He was dressed in a tailored 3-piece navy suit, looking like a CIO stepping out of a boardroom. He calmly shook out his umbrella, closed it, and stepped further into the diner. The temperature in the room plummeted. The 2 men at the counter froze. They didn't draw their weapons. They simply stood paralyzed, like prey that had just realized the shadow overhead belonged to a hawk. "Let her go, Silas," Dominic said. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It carried a weight that made the air heavy. Silas, the bored man, swallowed hard. "Rossi, you're supposed to be dead. Reports of my death are usually exaggerated by idiots who don't know how to aim," Dominic replied. He took slow, measured steps toward the counter. "I'll say it once more. Take your hand off her." The cinderblock man released Charlotte's wrist as if it had caught fire. Charlotte stumbled back, clutching her arm, her chest heaving. Dominic didn't look at her. His dark, flat eyes were fixed on the two men. "You tracked her down. You touched her." "That was a mistake. We were just doing a job, Dominic," Silas said, his voice cracking. The bored confidence was entirely gone, replaced by raw, naked terror. It was strictly business. "And this," Dominic said, stopping 5 feet from them, "is strictly personal." He moved faster than Charlotte's eyes could track. Dominic didn't pull a gun. He stepped into Silas's space, grabbed the back of the man's head, and slammed his face into the Formica counter with a sickening crunch. The cinderblock man roared and reached for his weapon. Dominic pivoted seamlessly, catching the man's arm, twisting it until a loud snap echoed through the empty diner. The man screamed, dropping to his knees. Dominic followed through with a brutal, precise kick to the side of the man's head. Silence slammed back into the room. Both men lay motionless on the checkered floor. It took less than 5 seconds. Charlotte stood frozen against the back counter, clutching her apron, staring at the carnage. Dominic straightened his suit jacket. He pulled a crisp white handkerchief from his breast pocket and wiped a drop of blood from his knuckles. Then, finally, he turned his head and looked at Charlotte. The terrifying, violent monster vanished in an instant, replaced by the calm, steady man she had patched up in the break room. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly. Charlotte could only stare at him, her mind a skipping record. Dominic Rossi. Dominic Rossi. "You," she croaked, her voice failing her. Dominic took a step toward her, his expression softening just a fraction. "I told you, Charlotte. People who step into alleys don't usually walk out. I couldn't let you be the exception." He knew her name. He had known exactly where she was. She hadn't saved a stranger. She had anchored herself to a kingpin. And as he stepped over the unconscious men to reach her, Charlotte realized with a terrifying certainty that her life as a waitress was officially over. Charlotte couldn't breathe. The air in the diner had turned to lead, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the smell of ozone. She stared at the two men contorted on the checkerboard linoleum. Neither was moving. Dominic Rossi lowered his hands. He adjusted his cuffs, his breathing perfectly even, as if he had just finished a brisk walk instead of paralyzing 2 professional killers. "Dave!" Charlotte choked out. The name scraped her throat. She shoved past Dominic, ignoring the sudden spike of fear that flared when her shoulder brushed his tailored jacket. She sprinted behind the counter, slipping on a puddle of spilled coffee, and scrambled toward the kitchen. Dave was slumped against the deep fryer, his white apron covered in a dusting of flour and a smear of bright red blood. Charlotte dropped to her knees. Her hands were shaking violently as she pressed 2 fingers against the side of his neck. A pulse, steady and strong. She let out a ragged sob, slumping back on her heels. "He's alive. He's just out cold." "They didn't come here to kill a cook," a deep voice said from the doorway. Dominic stood at the entrance to the kitchen. He filled the space entirely, blocking the fluorescent light from the main dining room. He held a sleek black cell phone to his ear. "Pell's Diner on 4th and Elm," Dominic said into the receiver. His tone was clipped. 2 packages for transit. Standard cleanup. Bring a car for me." He hung up, sliding the phone back into his jacket. He looked down at Charlotte, his expression unreadable. "Your boss will wake up with a concussion and a headache. By the time he does, this place will look exactly like it did an hour ago. He won't remember anything other than a man asking for a menu and a sudden flash of pain." Charlotte stood up slowly, her knees popping. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving greasy streaks across the fabric. "Clean up? What does that mean? Are you going to kill them?" "They came here to put a bullet in your stomach to find me. What I do with them is no longer your concern." Dominic stepped to the side, gesturing toward the back door. "Get your coat, Charlotte. You have exactly 4 minutes before my men arrive." "I'm not going anywhere with you." "That wasn't a request." Charlotte crossed her arms, digging her fingernails into her own biceps to keep from trembling. "I don't know who you think you are." "You know exactly who I am," Dominic interrupted. The calmness in his voice was infinitely more terrifying than a shout. "You pieced it together the second Silas said my name. I am the man who brought a war to your workplace. And right now, I am the only reason you aren't bleeding out next to the mop sink." He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Charlotte pressed her back against the stainless steel prep table. She tipped her head back to look at him. Up close, without the blood and dirt from the alley, he was jarringly handsome. Harsh aristocratic features, dark eyes that missed absolutely nothing, and a jawline carved from granite. "If you stay here, they will send more," Dominic said softly. "Next time, it won't be 2 men asking polite questions. They will burn this diner to the ground, with you inside it, just to send me a message. You intervened in syndicate business. You put a target on your back the second your lips touched mine." The memory of the kiss flashed between them, vivid and violent. Charlotte saw his gaze drop briefly to her mouth before snapping back to her eyes. "Get your coat," he repeated. Charlotte looked at Dave, sleeping peacefully on the flour-dusted tiles. She looked at her life, the greased traps, the minimum wage, the endless grind of survival. She was trading a slow death for a fast one. She turned on her heel, marched into the break room, and grabbed her faded denim jacket and her canvas tote bag. When she walked back out to the alley, a black armored SUV was idling by the dumpsters. The rain was coming down in sheets now, washing the grime off the asphalt. 3 men in dark raincoats were carrying heavy black duffel bags into the back door of the diner. They didn't look at her. They moved like ghosts. Dominic opened the heavy passenger door of the SUV. He stood in the rain, waiting. Charlotte didn't say a word. She climbed into the leather interior. It smelled like expensive leather and ozone. Dominic shut the door, cutting off the sound of the storm, and walked around to the driver's side. As he pulled the heavy vehicle out of the alley and into the slick city streets, Charlotte stared out the window. She watched the neon sign of Pell's Diner fade into the rearview mirror. OPN. She had a terrible feeling she was never going back. They drove in silence for 30 minutes. The city grid shifted from the decaying brick of the south side to the gleaming glass towers of the financial district. Dominic navigated the slick streets with a one-handed, effortless precision. He didn't turn on the radio. The only sound was the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers. Charlotte kept her arms wrapped tight around her chest. She was freezing, her clothes damp from the alley, but she refused to turn toward the heating vent. She refused to look at him. The SUV descended into a subterranean parking garage beneath a massive skyscraper. Concrete pillars, harsh security lights, and an iron gate that rolled open smoothly as they approached. Dominic parked in a private bay, killed the engine, and stepped out. Charlotte followed, Her cheap combat boots squeaked embarrassingly on the pristine epoxy floor. He led her to a private elevator. There were no buttons on the panel, just a glowing biometric scanner. Dominic pressed his thumb against the glass. The doors slid shut, and the elevator shot upward with a stomach-dropping speed. "Where are we?" Charlotte asked, her voice raspy. "My residence," Dominic said, staring at the polished metal doors. "It's a secure building. No one comes up without my authorization. You'll be safe here." Safe is a relative term. The corner of his mouth twitched, the ghost of a smirk. "Pragmatic? Good. You'll need that." The doors chimed and parted. Charlotte stepped out and immediately felt entirely out of place. The penthouse was massive, an open concept expanse of dark hardwood, charcoal slate, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying view of the city skyline. It wasn't decorated so much as it was curated. Sharp edges, minimalist furniture in shades of grey and black, and cold ambient lighting. It felt less like a home, and more like a high-end holding cell. "Down the hall, second door on the right," Dominic said, shrugging off his suit jacket and tossing it onto a leather sofa. "There's a bathroom attached. Towels are in the cabinet. Try to get some sleep." Charlotte gripped the straps of her canvas bag. "How long am I supposed to stay here?" Dominic unbuttoned his cuffs, finally turning to face her. The exhaustion he was hiding began to bleed through his stoic facade. The lines around his eyes were tight with pain. He was still injured. "Until I neutralize the threat you created," he said flatly. "The threat I created?" Charlotte laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "I'm sorry. Did I ask you to bleed out behind my dumpsters? I was trying to save your life. And in doing so, you humiliated a man named Vincent Coretti. Those men you saw tonight work for him. Coretti doesn't handle humiliation well. Until I tear his operation out by the roots, you are leverage, and I don't leave my leverage on the board for other people to take." He didn't wait for her to argue. He turned and walked down a separate hallway, leaving her alone in the massive, silent living room. Charlotte stood there for a long time. The city lights far below looked like scattered diamonds on black velvet, cold and entirely unreachable. She found her room. It was stark, clean, and dominated by a bed that looked larger than her entire apartment. She locked the heavy oak door behind her, though she knew a lock wouldn't stop a man like Dominic Rossi. She showered, the scalding water washing away the grease, the rain, and the lingering phantom sensation of a stranger's hand on her wrist. She wrapped herself in a thick, plush robe she found hanging on the door and sat on the edge of the mattress. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Silas pulling the gun, heard the wet crunch of his face hitting the counter. When the digital clock on the nightstand read 6 a.m., Charlotte gave up. She dressed in her wrinkled clothes from the night before, tied her damp hair into a messy knot, and left the room. She found Dominic in the kitchen. The kitchen was a chef's dream of marble and stainless steel. Dominic was standing by a sleek espresso machine, wearing a clean pair of dark slacks and a fresh white dress shirt, though he hadn't bothered with a tie, and the top 2 buttons were undone. He looked up as she walked in. "You didn't sleep," he noted, pulling a ceramic cup from the machine. "It's hard to relax when you've been kidnapped by the Mafia." "You weren't kidnapped. You were relocated for your own survival." He set the cup on the marble island and pushed it toward her. "Drink it. You look like you're going to pass out." Charlotte stepped up to the island, eyeing the dark liquid suspiciously. "Is it poisoned?" Dominic let out a low, rough exhale that might have been a laugh. "If I wanted you dead, Charlotte, I would have left you at the diner." She picked up the cup. The espresso was rich, incredibly smooth, and tasted nothing like the burnt sludge she served at Pell's. She took a slow sip, letting the caffeine hit her bloodstream. "So," Charlotte said, leaning against the counter. "What's the plan, Rossi? Do I sit in this glass box while you go out and play gangster?" Dominic leaned forward, resting both hands on the marble, bringing his face level with hers. The casual distance between them evaporated. "My life isn't a movie. It isn't a game. It is a very ugly, very quiet war. You are in this box because the alternative is a closed casket. Do not mistake my patience for softness. You will stay here. You will not contact anyone. You will exist exactly where I put you, until I say otherwise." Charlotte held his gaze. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she refused to look away. "I'm not a piece of furniture you can just place in a corner. I have a life." "You had a life," Dominic corrected, his voice dropping an octave. "You traded it away the second you walked into that alley." He reached out, his long fingers brushing lightly against her jaw. The touch was agonizingly gentle, entirely at odds with the brutality of his words. Charlotte flinched, but she didn't pull back. "You're a brave girl, Charlotte," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "But bravery doesn't stop bullets. Let me do what I do." He dropped his hand, turned, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Charlotte standing in the deafening silence of the penthouse, her skin burning where he had touched her. 3 days bled into one another. The penthouse became a beautiful, suffocating terrarium. Charlotte quickly learned the rhythms of the space. Dominic was rarely there during the day. When he was sequestered in his office, the heavy double doors firmly shut. She would hear the low murmur of his voice, sometimes sharp and commanding, sometimes deadly quiet. Men came and went, tall, broad-shouldered men in tailored suits who looked at Charlotte with a mixture of veiled curiosity and blatant suspicion. One of them was Arthur. Arthur was older, with silver at his temples and a nose that looked like it had been broken and reset 6 times. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, acting as Dominic's shadow and right hand. On the 4th afternoon, Charlotte was sitting in the living room, staring out at the grey, overcast sky, when Arthur walked in. He didn't announce himself. He simply materialized near the leather armchair opposite her. "You're pacing a rut into the floorboards, kid," Arthur said. His voice was gravelly, lacking the refined polish of Dominic's. Charlotte stopped, crossing her arms. "I'm bored, and I'm a prisoner. Prisoners tend to pace. You're a guest, a very expensive, highly inconvenient guest." Arthur pulled a silver lighter from his pocket, turning it over in his large hands. "I've been with Dominic for 15 years. I've seen him do a lot of things, rational things, ruthless things. Keeping you here? That breaks the pattern." "Tell him to let me go then. I'll gladly walk out the front door." Arthur stopped spinning the lighter. He looked at her, his eyes cold and hard. "If you walked out that door, you'd be in the trunk of a Coretti car before you reached the subway. You don't understand the machinery you threw a wrench into." "Enlighten me." "Coretti was supposed to take Dominic out in that alley. It was a setup, an ambush meant to shatter the syndicate and shift the balance of power in the city. When you pulled your little stunt, you didn't just save a man's life. You humiliated a boss. You made Coretti look weak in front of his own crew. In our world, weakness is a death sentence. He has to kill you to save face." Charlotte felt a cold sickness settle in her stomach. She hadn't just saved a guy from a mugging. She had altered the political landscape of the criminal underworld. "Dominic is systematically tearing Coretti's operation apart," Arthur continued, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. He's burning warehouses, hijacking shipments, and making examples out of lieutenants, all to draw the heat away from you. Men are dying because you couldn't look the other way. That's enough, Arthur. Dominic's voice cracked through the room like a whip. Charlotte jumped. Dominic stood in the hallway archway. He was wearing a dark button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes pronounced, but his posture was rigid with suppressed anger. Arthur stood up immediately, dipping his head. Just giving the girl some context, boss. I didn't ask you to educate her. I asked you to coordinate the shipment at the docks. Dominic stepped into the room. Leave. Arthur didn't argue. He pocketed his lighter, gave Charlotte a final, unreadable look, and walked out of the penthouse. The heavy front door clicked shut behind him. The silence rushed back in. Charlotte stared at Dominic. The sickness in her gut was twisting into a hard knot of guilt and defiance. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice tight. "Are people dying because of me?" Dominic walked over to a crystal decanter on a side table and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass. "People are dying because I run an empire built on blood. You are merely the current catalyst. Don't patronize me." Charlotte marched across the room, stopping an arm's length away from him. "He said you were tearing apart an operation just to keep the heat off me. Why? Why go to all this trouble? You could have just let them take me. It would have tied up your loose end." Dominic stopped with the glass halfway to his mouth. He lowered it slowly. He turned his head to look at her, and the intensity in his dark eyes pinned her to the spot. "Because I owe you a debt," he said softly. "Mafia bosses don't pay debts to waitresses. They do when the waitress steps in front of a loaded gun." Dominic set the glass down. The sharp clink echoed in the quiet room. He closed the distance between them, invading her space until she had to tilt her head up to maintain eye contact. "You want to know why you're here?" he murmured, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "It isn't just about the debt, Charlotte. You looked at me in that alley. I was bleeding out on the concrete, and you didn't see a monster. You didn't see a kingpin. You saw a man. And you grabbed me." He lifted a hand, his knuckles grazing the sensitive skin beneath her jaw. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. Her heart was hammering violently, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She should pull away. She should slap his hand. But she was paralyzed by the raw, magnetic pull of the man standing in front of her. "You kissed me," Dominic said, his gaze dropping to her lips. The air between them grew heavy, thick with an undeniable suffocating tension. "You put your mouth on mine, and you dragged me out of the dark. I have spent my entire life in the dark, Charlotte. I am not used to the light, and I am entirely unwilling to let it go." Charlotte swallowed hard. The cynicism she had worn as armor for years was cracking, splintering under the weight of his confession. He wasn't holding her here just to protect her. He was holding her here because she had inadvertently anchored herself to him. "Dominic," she breathed, his name slipping out before she could stop it. Before he could answer, the heavy double doors of his office banged open down the hall. Dominic's hand dropped from her jaw instantly. The softness vanished, replaced by a terrifying, lethal coldness. He spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the small of his back, where his jacket usually hid a weapon. A younger man, out of breath and bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow, stood in the hallway. "Boss!" the man gasped, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "It's the docks. Coretti hit back. Arthur's down." Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He simply turned back to Charlotte, his eyes black and hollow. "Go to your room," he ordered, the warmth of the previous moment completely eradicated. "Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." He didn't wait for her to process the command. He walked past her, his strides long and purposeful, stepping back into the war that was tearing the city apart. Charlotte stood alone in the center of the penthouse, listening to the heavy front door slam shut, realizing with absolute certainty that the cage she was locked in was about to become a war zone. The click of the deadbolt sounded like a gunshot in the empty hallway. Charlotte backed away from the heavy oak door, her bare feet silent against the hardwood. She retreated until her spine hit the edge of the mattress. Then she sat. And she waited. Hours bled into one another. The storm outside finally broke, leaving behind a heavy, bruised sky that pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The penthouse was completely silent, but the quiet wasn't peaceful. It felt like the air before a bomb detonates. Charlotte didn't turn on the lights. She watched the city below transition from the frantic neon of midnight to the washed-out grey of false dawn. Her mind played vicious tricks on her. Every groan of the building's pipes sounded like a footstep. Every shadow stretched into the shape of a man holding a suppressed pistol. She thought about Dave waking up with a headache on the diner floor. She thought about her cramped, drafty apartment with the eviction notice taped to the fridge. It felt like a lifetime ago. That Charlotte was dead. This Charlotte was sitting in a multi-million-dollar cage, waiting to find out if the man who held the key was coming back. At 6:15 a.m., the front door of the penthouse opened. Charlotte bolted upright. She grabbed the heavy brass lamp from the nightstand, her knuckles turning white, and pressed herself against the wall beside her bedroom door. Footsteps. Slow, dragging, heavy. Someone leaned against the wall in the hallway. A wet, tearing cough echoed through the open space, followed by a low curse. Charlotte recognized the voice. She set the lamp down, unlocked her door, and stepped out. Dominic was leaning against the entryway console table. The tailored jacket was gone. His dress shirt, once pristine white, was a ruin of dirt or grease and dark, spreading crimson. He had his left arm wrapped tightly against his ribs, his breath coming in ragged, shallow pulls. He looked up as she stepped into the hallway. The terrifying, untouchable kingpin was gone. He looked exhausted. He looked human. "Arthur?" Charlotte asked. The word caught in her dry throat. Dominic closed his eyes. The muscle in his jaw feathered. "Gone!" The word dropped between them like a stone. Charlotte felt a hollow ache in her chest for a man she had spoken to exactly once. She walked toward Dominic, the fear evaporating, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. She had done this before, in an alley. She knew how to play this part. "Sit down," she ordered, pointing to the leather sofa. He didn't argue. He limped forward and collapsed onto the cushions, his head tipping back against the leather. Charlotte moved to the kitchen, grabbed a clean dish towel, soaked it in warm water, and returned to the living room. "Take the shirt off," she said. Dominic's fingers fumbled clumsily with the buttons. He was shaking. Blood loss, adrenaline crash, or both. Charlotte brushed his hands away. "Let me." She unbuttoned the ruined fabric and peeled it back. He had a deep, ugly laceration across his left bicep, and a fresh expanse of purple-black bruising along his ribs, dangerously close to the bullet graze she had patched days ago. She pressed the warm, damp towel to the cut on his arm. He hissed, his eyes flying open, locking onto hers. "Coretti is making his final push," Dominic rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "He hit the docks to draw my men out. It was a slaughter, but we broke his supply lines. He has nothing left. He's a cornered animal." "Stop talking," Charlotte said, wiping the grime from his collarbone. "You need a doctor, a real one." "My physician is dead. Coretti got to him 3 hours ago." Charlotte's hand froze. The scale of the violence, The sheer, ruthless scope of it crashed over her. "Dominic, this has to end. You're going to get yourself killed." "It ends tonight," he said. He reached up, his large, blood-stained hand wrapping gently around her wrist. He didn't push her away. He just held her hand against his chest. She could feel the heavy, frantic beat of his heart against her palm. "I sent my remaining men to hit his safe house, but I came back here." "Why?" "Because you were here." He looked at her, and all the walls were gone. The calculation, the coldness, the armor he wore to rule his world. It was stripped away. "I told you I owe you a debt," he murmured, his thumb stroking the inside of her wrist. "I lied. It was never about a debt. It was about the fact that for the first time in 10 years, someone looked at me and didn't see a paycheck or a target. You just saw a man who needed help." He pulled her wrist slightly, urging her closer. Charlotte didn't resist. She let herself sink onto the edge of the coffee table, her knees brushing his legs. "You're a terrifying man, Rossi," she whispered. "I know." He let go of her wrist and cupped her face. His skin was hot, rough with dried blood and sweat. "Are you afraid of me?" "No," Charlotte answered. And the terrifying part was, it was the absolute truth. Dominic pulled her down. The kiss was nothing like the desperate, violent collision in the alley. It was slow, exhausted, entirely consuming. He tasted like copper and rain, but underneath it all, he felt like an anchor in a raging storm. Charlotte slid her hands into his hair, leaning into him, letting the cold reality of the city outside melt away into the heat of his mouth. He kissed her like a man starving, his good arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. For a moment, there was no war. There was no syndicate. There was just the quiet hum of the penthouse and the desperate friction of two people trying to prove they were still alive. Then the lights went out. The sudden, absolute darkness was shocking. The ambient hum of the refrigerator, the faint whir of the HVAC system, everything died instantly. The silence that followed was thick and unnatural. Dominic shoved Charlotte off him so fast she stumbled backward, hitting the floor hard. "Stay down!" he hissed. The exhaustion in his voice was gone. The machine had rebooted. A sharp, metallic clunk echoed from the front of the apartment. The magnetic locks on the heavy oak doors had disengaged when the power was cut. They bypassed the backup generators, Dominic whispered, his silhouette a dark smudge against the faint grey light spilling from the windows. He was moving, fast and silent. Charlotte heard the distinct, terrifying, metallic slide of a gun chambering around. "Coretti?" she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs, so hard it hurt. He didn't wait at his safe house. He came here. Dominic crouched beside her. He pressed something heavy and cold into her hands. A compact 9mm pistol. "Safety is off. Point and pull. Do not hesitate, Charlotte. If they get past me, empty the magazine." "Dominic, get behind the kitchen island, now." Charlotte crawled. She dragged herself across the hardwood, the gun heavy and slick in her sweating palms. She scrambled behind the thick slab of marble, just as the front doors of the penthouse kicked open. The sound of suppressed gunfire is nothing like the movies. It doesn't sound like a chirp. It sounds like a heavy industrial nail gun, a sharp, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack that punches through drywall and shatters glass. The front window of the penthouse exploded inward. Glass rained down on the hardwood like jagged hail. "Rossi!" a voice bellowed from the hallway. It was rough, wet with age and rage. "Coretti, you think you can dismantle my family and hide in a glass tower? Come out here and die like a man." Dominic didn't answer with words. 2 rapid shots cracked from the living room. A heavy thud followed, as a body hit the floorboards. Charlotte pressed her back against the marble cabinets, clamping her hands over her ears, but she kept her eyes open. She peeked around the edge of the island. 3 men were moving through the entryway, sweeping flashlights mounted onto their weapons across the dark room. Dominic was a ghost. He was using the shadows, the layout of his own home, to his absolute advantage. He fired twice from behind a concrete pillar. Another man dropped, his flashlight rolling uselessly across the floor. "Flush him out!" Coretti yelled. He was staying in the hallway, letting his men take the fatal ground. One of the men broke off, sprinting toward the kitchen to flank Dominic's position. He was moving fast, his weapon raised, sweeping the area. The beam of his flashlight caught the edge of the marble island. He slowed down, his boots crunching loudly on the broken glass. He was coming right for her. Charlotte's breath locked in her throat. She gripped the pistol Dominic had given her, point and pull. But her hands were shaking so violently, she could barely keep the barrel straight. The man rounded the corner. The blinding beam of his flashlight hit her squarely in the face. "Got the girl," the man grunted. He raised his gun. Charlotte didn't think. The survival instinct that had pushed her into the alley completely took over. She threw her left hand up, hurling the heavy ceramic espresso cup she had left on the counter hours ago squarely at the flashlight. It shattered against the man's weapon. He flinched, instinctively turning his head away from the flying debris. Charlotte squeezed the trigger. The recoil cracked her wrist backward with agonizing force. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. She missed his chest entirely, the bullet tearing into the man's thigh. He screamed, his leg buckling out from under him. He hit the floor, his gun clattering across the tiles. Before he could reach for it, a dark shape vaulted over the marble island. Dominic landed squarely on the man's chest. He didn't use his gun. He grabbed the man's collar, twisted violently, and slammed the butt of his pistol into the man's temple. The attacker went limp instantly. Dominic rolled off him, pressing his back against the cabinets next to Charlotte. He was breathing hard, his eyes completely black in the dim light. He looked at the gun in her hand, then at the man on the floor. "Nice shot," he muttered. "I was aiming for his chest," Charlotte gasped, her ears ringing violently. "I'm out," Dominic said, dropping the empty magazine from his weapon. He patted his ruined shirt. No spares. The silence stretched. 2 men dead in the living room, 1 unconscious in the kitchen. "Rossi!" Coretti yelled. His voice was closer now. He had stepped into the living room. "I know you're empty. I counted the shots. You always were arrogant. You never carry backup." Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Coretti was walking toward the kitchen. Dominic looked at Charlotte. He reached out, his bloody hand wrapping over her trembling fingers, gripping the gun she held. He didn't take it from her. He just steadied her hand. "When he clears the corner," Dominic whispered, his lips inches from her ear, "I'm going to rush him. You shoot him." "Dominic, he'll kill you before you reach him. He'll try. Look at me, Charlotte." She tore her eyes away from the edge of the counter and looked at him. "Do not hesitate," he said softly. The footsteps stopped. The shadow of a man fell across the kitchen tiles. Dominic moved. He exploded upward from behind the counter, lunging forward with a terrifying, primal speed. Coretti fired. The suppressed shot hit Dominic in the shoulder, spinning him violently, but the momentum carried him forward. He slammed into Coretti, pinning the older man's gun arm against the refrigerator. They grappled, a desperate, brutal struggle between a wounded tiger and an aging wolf. Coretti was trying to bring his weapon up. Dominic was bleeding heavily, his grip slipping. "Shoot him!" Dominic roared. Charlotte stood up. The gun felt like a block of lead. She raised it. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. The cold, mechanical reality of the world she had entered finally clicked into place. This was survival. She aimed squarely at the center of Coretti's back. She pulled the trigger. Coretti froze. A ragged gasp tore from his lips. His grip on his weapon loosened, the gun clattering uselessly to the floor. Dominic shoved him backward. The older man stumbled, his eyes wide and vacant, before collapsing onto the shattered glass. He didn't move again. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a harsh, unforgiving light into the ruined penthouse. It illuminated the shattered glass, the overturned furniture, and the pooling blood on the expensive hardwood floors. Dominic sat heavily on the edge of the leather sofa. A makeshift bandage, fashioned from a clean bedsheet, was tied tightly around his shoulder. The bleeding had slowed, but he looked incredibly pale. Charlotte stood by the broken window, letting the freezing city air hit her face. Her hands were clean. She had washed them in the kitchen sink until the skin was raw, but she still felt the phantom recoil of the gun in her wrist. The door to the penthouse was open. A clean-up crew, silent men in dark coveralls, were efficiently and methodically removing the bodies and scrubbing the floors. They ignored Dominic. They ignored her. They worked like ghosts. "My men secured the city," Dominic said quietly. His voice was hoarse. Coretti's lieutenants surrendered when they heard he was dead. The war is over. Charlotte turned around. At what cost? Dominic didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket with his good arm and pulled out a thick, manila envelope. He tossed it onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud. "There's $200,000 in untraceable cash in there," Dominic said, staring at the envelope. A passport with a new name, a driver's license, the keys to a car parked 3 blocks from here, and the deed to a house in a quiet town in Colorado. Charlotte stared at the envelope. It was a lifeline. It was an exit door. "You're free, Charlotte," Dominic continued. He finally looked up at her, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes made her breath hitch. "The threat is neutralized. No one will ever look for you. You can take that envelope, walk out that door, and never see a gun or blood or me ever again." He was giving her exactly what she had asked for 3 days ago. Charlotte walked slowly toward the coffee table. She looked down at the manila envelope. 200 grand. A house. Safety. Boredom. A quiet life where the most dangerous thing was a burned cup of coffee. She looked up at Dominic. He was watching her carefully, his jaw tight, completely bracing himself for her to walk away. He was a man who commanded an empire, but in this moment, he was entirely at her mercy. "Who is the passport for?" Charlotte asked quietly. "Someone named Sarah Jenkins." "I don't like the name Sarah." Dominic frowned slightly, confusion breaking through his stoic mask. "Charlotte. And Colorado is entirely too landlocked for my taste." Charlotte stepped past the coffee table. She didn't touch the envelope. She walked right up to the sofa and stood between his knees. "What are you doing?" Dominic asked, his voice dropping an octave. "I'm making a very stupid decision," Charlotte said. She reached down, grabbed the lapels of his ruined, blood-stained shirt, and pulled his face to hers. She kissed him. It wasn't desperate like the alley. It wasn't exhausted like the quiet hours of the morning. It was deliberate. It was a promise. Dominic groaned against her mouth, his uninjured arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her down into his lap. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of her hair, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "You're choosing the dark, Charlotte," he whispered against her skin, a final warning. "I'm choosing you," she corrected, sliding her fingers into his hair. "Besides, someone has to make sure you don't bleed out in any more alleys. You're terribly accident-prone for a mafia boss." A low, genuine laugh vibrated in Dominic's chest. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, the cold, ruthless kingpin entirely replaced by a man who had finally found something worth keeping. "I'll burn the city down before I let anything happen to you," he vowed softly. Charlotte looked around the ruined penthouse, at the shattered glass and the bloodstains being washed away by silent men. She knew what she was stepping into. She knew it would be violent and dangerous and entirely unpredictable. But as Dominic pulled her back against his chest, holding her like she was the only anchor keeping him tethered to the earth, Charlotte realized she didn't care. She had kissed the devil in the dark, and she was staying. Charlotte walked into an alley to save a stranger, and ended up saving the most dangerous man in the city. She was given a way out. Cash, a new name, a quiet life. But sometimes the dark is exactly where you belong. Dominic Rossi finally found a weakness he refused to hide, and Charlotte found a world where she made the rules. Did she make the right choice, or is this just the beginning of a deadlier game? Drop a like, share this story, and subscribe to our channel for more dark romance and gritty underworld tales. Let us know in the comments, would you have taken the money or stayed with the boss?